Hey everybody, tonight I want to shoot a video about algae and algae control and even cyanobacteria a little bit because I did have some of that growing in a few of my tanks. If you follow along with my videos, you will probably know that I recently sort of re-evaluated the way I managed my fish tanks. If you're not familiar with my videos, I will tell you, I recently re-evaluated the way I've been managing my fish tanks. All along, first I said I've been, treating my tanks like an amateur the way I feed them. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that that's not true. When I was a real amateur at it, I actually fed my tanks less. I gave them less light. I went much more by what I will call the rules of how you're supposed to keep a fish tank. The more I learned about how to manage a fish tank, the more I realized you can stock them heavily, you can feed them heavily, etc. And so I began doing that, and I wound up having, some tanks that were very heavily stocked. We'll get into that in a minute because this tank is crazy. But if you manage it correctly, you can do it. You can pull it off. And I was always willing to do the maintenance that was involved in managing a tank that way. As I've always said, it's a high maintenance way of doing it. It involves a lot of water changes, it involves a lot of algae cleaning, etc., etc. I've never been confused about why I had algae in my tank. I've never been confused about why I had elevated organics in my tank. I knew where they were coming from. I did have some concerns as to why they were not coming down after water changes, but I sorted that out. And, time went on, and here recently I decided that I was going to basically attack the algae problem with different methods. Not to get in there and scrape it out method, but to let's manage our tanks differently and see if we can actually just, remove the algae altogether so it's no longer an issue. Well, as you can see, I was more than successful, and I was too successful. This is probably going to be the only video you're ever going to see of somebody complaining that all their algae is gone, but that's what this video is going to be about. All my algae is gone. I like algae in a tank. I don't like it to be overgrown, and it's always that, balance between where it looks good and where it's becoming problematic or it's looking problematic, etc. And this tank was one of the ones that was on the cusp of being difficult. I did a lot of maintenance on it, but I didn't mind it, and it looked natural to me. It looked lived in. I really liked the way it looked. So what has happened? What did I do to get my algae to just vanish? All I did really was cut way back on the feeding. I cut way back on the feeding. I probably cut back by 75%. And I went to the sort of, all they could eat in a couple of minutes twice a day sort of, feeding. I reduced not only the amount of light on the tank, but I also reduced the photo period by an hour or two each day. So I took it from maybe 12 hours down to about 10 hours, which again is not much, but it was a little something. The key thing I did was reduce the feeding, and I reduced the amount of organics I was putting in a tank. Another thing I did is, if you will notice right here, I have a CO2 counter. That blinking light actually tells me how much CO2 is in the atmosphere down here. And it is a lot less now than it was over the winter because the house is no longer all closed up and the windows have been open. And I've reduced the CO2 by about 2/3 down here. And that does correlate to my tanks. I've done some testing and I've proven out that elevated levels of CO2 in the atmosphere will translate into your tank. So what effect that has on the algae, I don't know, and I'm not trying to put too heavy of an impact on what the CO2 reduction had on the algae. I've actually heard people tell me if I crank the CO2 up, it will reduce algae. So I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there because that is something that has changed right around the same time I started doing this other stuff. So that's possibly a factor. I don't know. All I know is my algae is gone. One of the other things I did is I added a few more small, what I will for the moment call algae eating fish to this tank. I already had some otocinclus in here. I added a few more. So now I think I have 6 otocinclus in here. And then I added 2 very small rubber lip catfish. They're basically store-bought size, so they're 1.5 inches long. And I bought 1 very small Farlawella catfish, a little twig catfish. I have seen it a few days ago, so I'm pretty sure it's still alive in there. But as you can see, it's got a lot of places to hide, and a very small little twig catfish can vanish in a tank like this for very long periods of time. So what happened was I did all this stuff, and then I just sat back and I watched and I managed my tank differently, and all of the algae vanished. And not only did all the algae vanish, all of the Aufwuchs vanished. And I think of the Aufwuchs in the tank as the patina in the tank. It makes it look lived in, it makes it look natural, and it's a good natural food source. A sterile tank, a very clean tank, is not necessarily a healthy one. Of course, a dirty tank is not necessarily a healthy one either. But there's a difference between lots of life in a tank and a dirty tank. And if you will notice, all of my rocks used to have this nice dark brown color to them, and now they look like rocks again. And that is because everything has just been scoured off of them. The back glass used to have green Spiro Gyra algae growing all over it. In fact, my spray bar used to have a reddish cyanobacteria growing all over it. That's almost gone now. All of my plants had the long hair algae growing on them, and it's just gone. So I'm actually concerned about it for two reasons. I've got a couple of things going on here. One is just aesthetics. You know, I've already discussed I like the algae in a tank, and it's just gone, and I miss my algae, and I want it back. The other thing is the fish that I've added to this tank, and we can actually go look at this tank because this is a good example as well. This tank has a Chinese algae eater in it, and that's probably the most prime example of the kind of fish I'm talking about. Most people think of those kinds of fish as algae-eating fish, the kinds that have a sucker mouth, my rubber-lip plecos, the farluella, the otocinclus. There's a lot of fish that'll do that, and they'll scrape and scour, and they'll clean your glass, and they'll clean your rocks. And that, to me, is not an algae-eating fish. That is an Aufwuchs grazer. An algae-eating fish is something like a guppy or a molly, or in this case, in this tank, my gouramis. My gouramis love algae. And if you'll remember, if you've seen my other videos, or if you go look at the Gourami Tank playlist and you look at some of the older videos of this tank, you'll notice that the way that green algae was, and I didn't know what it was for a long time. I actually talked about it, and with great confusion. I liked it, but I wasn't sure what it was, so I wasn't sure whether I wanted it in the tank or not. And it just looked beautiful. It looked like green velvet. And the reason it looked like green velvet and not like long strands of flowing hair algae, look there, you can see one of those new rubber lips right on the back glass back there. The reason it looked all neat and shorn clean like that, and it looked like it was the front lawn of somebody's house, was because of my gouramis, and they would feed on it and munch it down. So with that not being in the tank, that's not that big a deal to my gouramis. My gouramis have been munching on the water sprite roots. They've been munching now that I haven't been feeding them as much. They've been eating on my temple plant in there. So I'm actually to the point where I really need to start increasing the amount I'm feeding. They're starting to do a little more damage than I want to the vegetation in the tank. And I want to actually bring my nitrate levels back up. And again, we'll get to that in a minute too. So what has happened is I've got these fish that, again, we will call algae-eating fish, like my otocinclus or whatever, but they're not algae-eating fish, they're Aufwuchs-eating fish. And the Aufwuchs is a lot different than just algae. Aufwuchs is a stew of little microorganisms, crustaceans, worms. There's all sorts of good stuff in there. There's calcium, there's protein. And that's what fish like the otocinclus and the rubber lips need. And in this case, in this tank, I don't even see him. Let me look around for a minute. He's a big guy, so he's not hard to find usually. Somewhere in here is my Chinese algae eater. And Chinese algae eaters are often suggested not to be kept with angelfish. And one of the reasons is, see, he's down here somewhere. One of the reasons is, see, that's my Pimelotus pictus catfish right there, and that stupid algae eater gets in there and chases him out of his cave constantly. He's not a very pleasant fish. The reason you're not supposed to keep Chinese algae eaters with flatfish like angelfish or gouramis, for example, is that as they age, they actually need a meatier diet, and the meatier diet, if that's not met, will be met by attacking the slime coat of your flat-bodied fish like angelfish. So I have noticed over the months and months of having this fish in here, he's probably about 1.5 years old now, When I cut back on the feeding, it's only a matter of time before he starts harassing my angelfish. Once he starts harassing my angelfish, I actually just sort of increase the amount of food I'm putting in the tank, specifically sinking shrimp pellets, because that's a nice, good, meaty food source for him, and he immediately leaves the angelfish alone again, and he gets a proper diet. So that's why these Aufwuchs Grazers, these sucker type fish, aren't simply algae eaters. They really do need a meatier diet. And in the case of this tank, I have actually added some fish that need that type of diet while simultaneously removing everything in the tank that they should be eating. So it's not just a matter of me not liking the way the tank looks anymore. I don't have proper food sources for the fish I've got in this tank now. So I actually need to increase my lighting, and I need to blow up my nutrients again. Maybe not much, but I do want to increase them. Now, one of the things I found absolutely fascinating about all of this experiment I've been doing over the last few weeks is this tank was the worst, but it is my most heavily stocked out of all of these tanks that we're going to look at. We'll look at the T-bar tank here for a second too, because this is another one I've done the same thing. This was probably my most problematic tank. It had really long strand Spiro Gyra Hair Algae in it, and nothing in there. I didn't have any kind of algae eating fish in here at all that would bother that. So I've actually put 2 rubber lip plecos in here, and again I've done the same thing. I've reduced the lighting a little bit, not a lot, and I have reduced the feeding considerably. And look at what this tank looks like. I mean, I have to get in there with a scrub brush normally before I can see anything that's approaching the color of wood. And yet my wood is being rasped clean. My rocks are being scraped clean. Those 2 little fish in there are actually eating up their own food source, and pretty soon this tank is going to be too clean. The other tank we're going to be looking at when we do the before and after is my 125 here. Now this tank's going to get a little more than just a water change. I'm going to get in there. I need to do a little bit of grooming on the plants. We can take a look at those real quick. If you'll notice, I'm going to leave this alone for now, but I do want to show you. If you see those roots that are hanging down, obviously that leaf is floating free. That needs to come out. But those roots are actually new plants. So while I can leave that main body alone to spread out over the surface like that, I can actually tease those roots out and I'll get entire new plants out of it. Now, one thing I am going to probably have to do with this tank is put another power head in here, maybe just to get a little surface agitation on this end. It may not be an issue. I may not get too much biofilm showing up on it, but if I do, I'll just do something to address that. The only reason is this plant simply blocks the water flow across the surface. Down this end of the tank, you can see there's water movement and everything's fine. Contrary to popular belief, you do not need a ton of agitation on the surface of your tanks. None of mine have it. I don't like a ton of agitation on the surface of my tanks. And so I don't have it. I've got plenty of circulation. I just don't have a lot of agitation. There's a difference. These temple plants, these narrow leaf temple plants, are going to need to be trimmed down too. They're actually lying across the surface up there. So I'm going to cut them about in the middle, which will cause them to get much branchier and bushier in the long run. This temple plant back here is also, well, the gourami's kind of in front of it at the moment, but that's also growing up to the surface, so that's going to need to be trimmed down and cut back. And then, of course, I'm going to clean out any loose debris and detritus that's floating around in there, etc. But the main thing that needs to be done on all 3 of these tanks is a simple water change, only because the tannins are building up into the tanks, that it's getting a little darker than my liking. It's not that these tanks actually need any water change at all. So let's talk a little bit about that, because this blew me away. I went from feeding my tanks, and we'll talk about this tank in particular. You all know I love this tank. It's my favorite. I video it all the time. I always talk about it. And I used to feed this like, you know, I spoil these fish to death. That's why I have such big, beautiful, healthy fish. I didn't overfeed them. I just maxed them out. I fed them a lot. And I fed them all day long. Every time they'd bang up against the glass, waving their little fins at me, I'd go over and give them another little treat. And I fed them a well-rounded diet. I just really, really spoiled these fish for food. And usually I could go about a week to 10 days between water changes, and the water, my nitrates would get up, maybe 40 parts per million within a week or something like that. Not too much above that. So it was no big deal. I would just do a nice big water change and everything was fine. Well, it has now been 2 weeks since I've done a water change on this tank, and I've just been kind of keeping my eye on it and watching it. My nitrates in this tank are just now getting up to 40 parts per million. They're not quite there yet, but I'm going to call it 40 parts per million. If you're familiar with the API test kit, the color change goes through like a brownish color, and then it begins shifting into red around 40 parts per million. I'm kind of on that cusp of shifting into red. So I'm going to call it 40, and it's time to do a water change on this tank. So this tank, it has been over 2 weeks since I've done a water change, and the nitrates in this tank, which is less heavily stocked, are a little over 20. They're about 25 maybe, we'll call it. My 125 African themed tank here, it has been at least 3 weeks since I've done a water change. I honestly do not remember the last time I did a water change on this tank, and the nitrates in this tank are under 20. They're above 10, but they're not 20 yet. So I'm kind of scratching my head at this point. I kind of always thought, keeping your nitrates under control, keeping algae under control was going to be really challenging and difficult, since I've never really attempted it. Since day one, I have just fed my tanks heavily. I've just dealt with scraping the glass and cleaning my rocks and getting in there and scrubbing a little bit. And I've never attempted to simply manage my tanks differently and get rid of the algae and lower my nitrates, etc. I had no idea it would simply be a matter of just stop throwing handfuls of food in your tanks every day, cut the lighting back a little bit, and poof, you're done, no problems. And that's pretty much what happened. So again, I'm now in a situation where I think I've swung the pendulum a little too far the other direction, and I need to jack my nutrients back up to allow for some more Aufwuchs growth in there and some more algal growth. So again, I don't mind doing the maintenance on it, and my main concern would be the the health and the well-being of the animals. As long as the water's not getting too dirty for the fish, I'm good to go. I don't mind, So I don't know what we're going to do exactly yet. Something tells me I really don't want to go back to really heavily feeding. The first thing we're probably going to do is go back to heavily lighting it. This tank is going to get a lot of that floating water sprite pulled out. You can see that left corner is just getting so dark. The plants down there don't really get enough light anymore. And then other than that, all that's really happening to any of these tanks is going to be a water change, and then we're going to shift the lighting back over. So I'm actually going to go back to putting my shop lamp on top of this tank again and lighten it up. I'll put some more floating plants in there for the gouramis, because they are fish that prefer more subdued lighting. They do like a nice calm still surface, and they like floating vegetation above them as a sense of security. So I will put some more floating plants in there before I put brighter light on top of them. But between the tannin removal and the increase in light, you're going to see this tank just light up and be a nice bright lit tank again. And hopefully within a few weeks, you're actually going to see this tank starting to look a lot more natural and a lot less like I just slapped this thing together yesterday, because that's what it looks like to me. It looks like a brand new shiny, sparkly tank, and that just does not look right to me. So there you have it. First video ever you've probably heard where someone is complaining that they got rid of all their algae by accident and now they want some of it. And there you go. So I saved this tank for last because I do want to talk about this one a little more. It's not quite as brightly lit as I was expecting it to be, and that is mainly because I just really loaded it up with the floating plants. This was the tank that had the highest level of organics in it. My nitrates were above 40 parts per million by the time I really did actually get around to doing the water change. It was several days after the first part of this video. So that was yesterday. I actually did do about 175 gallons of water change on all the tanks. Did a lot of maintenance in the African tank, or in the 125 I should say, and then the other tanks basically just got a water change and the glass wiped down. This tank, however, I do want to talk a little bit more about because I never really got into the stocking density. If you consider the stocking density in this tank, and then you think about what those nutrient levels were after, I'll say well over 2 weeks by the time I got around to doing the water change. I don't really know how long it was, but it was over 2 weeks, and I was about at 40 parts per million. Now, that might not be that impressive to you until you hear how many fish are in here. I did a rough head count the other day because a friend of mine was suggesting that with all these large gouramis in here, the tank might be a little on the overstocked side. So when I actually told him how many fish were really in here after I counted, he was rather surprised. I actually have 33 fish in this tank, and they come to a grand total of 116 inches. And that is not approximate full-grown size. That is, as best I can guesstimate, their current size is 116 inches. So I've got a lot of fish in this tank. Now, I've always joked about how if I put any more fish in my tanks, I would need a crowbar to get them in there. And now maybe you can understand why. This is my most heavily stocked tank, but my angelfish tank here, I don't know everything that's in there off the top of my head, but I've got 5 angelfish, 15 or 16 of those Serpae tetras. I've got that big algae eater. I've got the rainbow shark. I've got a Synodontis petricola. I don't know. There's a bunch of stuff in there. There's a Bolivian ram in there. I've got a Pimelotus pictus catfish. Chronocycla compressiceps. I've got a hatchet fish. I got a lot of fish in this tank. You know, this is one of my earlier tanks, and I really did just cram fish in there with the crowbar. I put as many in there as I can. So I can well imagine that if you had a tank that you had, you know, I won't call this tank heavily planted necessarily, but it's pretty well planted. And if you had a normal stocking load in there, or even a light stocking load, if you had, you know, a school of neon swimming around in there and then maybe 1 or 2 feature fish, I could well see going months at a time without doing water changes and just allowing those plants to drink up those nutrients. I did just shoot a video the other day where I talked about the pothos plant in my 20 long, and I mentioned the whole idea of a no water change type system by simply growing a lot of pothos plant out of it. I don't think you could have a no water change system, but I think you could get pretty close if you grew enough plants and had a lightly enough stocked tank. There's that Chinese algae eater. For as long as I've been waiting to see that big boy, he's finally out. So he's a pretty beefy sized fish, and he will chow through some Aufwuchs and algae in the tank. And again, I've just lost all of it, so I really do need to get this stuff growing again. I don't think I'm going to go back with the real heavy feeding like I said, but I have stepped up the feeding a little bit. I do want to bump it up a little bit, and I've kicked that light back up. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. I thank you for watching if you did sit through all of this, and I hope you enjoyed that little surprise of how many fish are actually in this tank. That should change your perspective on how I've been maintaining this tank over the last 1.5 years. So thanks again for watching. Again, if you're not already subscribed, please go ahead and do so, and I will see you real soon on the next one. Thanks a lot.